I am 77 years old, and on most mornings my life begins in silence that is almost ceremonial. I rise slowly from the bed, joints creaking like the old beams of this house that has held me for more than half my life, and I walk across the wooden floor to the kitchen where the light comes in through curtains my late wife sewed with her own hands. I still make coffee the way she did, although it never tastes the same. There was a tenderness in the way she handled even the simplest task, pouring the grounds with the patience of someone who believed that a small daily ritual could hold a family together. When she died 6 years ago, the taste of that coffee vanished with her, and I have never been able to replicate it, though every morning I try again as if repeating the process might somehow call her back. I live alone in a 2-story house at the edge of town, in a neighborhood where the children of my neighbors grew up, left for the cities, and never returned. The houses around mine have changed owners, young couples come and go, but my house is like a stubborn monument to a time when family still meant something solid, something one could lean on. It was not always so desolate. In my working years, I was the provider, the accountant who never missed a bill, the man who measured life in careful calculations, always with an eye toward the future. My wife trusted me with the numbers and with the decisions, and together we managed to raise our daughter Mary in security. Mary was our pride, our only child, and we believed we gave her everything she needed to live not only comfortably, but also honorably. She was clever, quick with words, always determined to outshine others, and her teachers predicted a bright career for her. We were proud of her sharpness, but I sometimes noticed how she used that cleverness to wound rather than to illuminate, how she would cut down a classmate with a remark that sounded like a compliment until one thought about it twice. My wife excused it as youthful confidence, insisting she would grow gentler with age, but I had my doubts. Still, I loved her too much to let such suspicions harden. We told ourselves she would mature into kindness once she faced real life. Time moved forward as it always does, without consulting us. Mary studied, built her career in insurance, married a man named Douglas who worked in finance, and together they presented themselves as the perfect middle-class family, efficient, ambitious, respectable. They had 2 children, my grandchildren, whom I once carried on my shoulders through the park, whose laughter once filled my Sundays with a kind of music I did not know I would later miss like oxygen. In those days, I believed the cycle of family would continue without interruption. I would grow old, but they would keep me in their orbit, as I had once kept my own parents near until their final days. I thought that was how families worked, each generation folding the last into its fabric. But things did not unfold that way. The truth is that after my wife died, Mary grew distant in a way that was not merely about grief. She began to treat me as though I were not entirely necessary anymore, as though I were a remnant from a chapter she had closed. She rarely visited except when she needed something practical, a loan for her children's tuition, assistance for a down payment, or help covering the cost of renovations. Each time, I told myself it was my duty, that giving was the way a father showed love even when gratitude was thin. I told myself that she was busy, that modern life allowed little space for sentiment, and that perhaps she simply did not know how to bridge the distance between us. But the unspoken truth, the one that gnawed at me during lonely evenings, was that she no longer sought my company unless it came with a checkbook attached. Loneliness at my age is not a sharp wound, but a slow erosion. It wears you down grain by grain until one day you realize that silence has become the dominant voice in your home. The house that once rang with the voices of my wife and daughter, the sound of pots and pans, the piano lessons of a younger Mary, has become a cavern where only the refrigerator hums and the floorboards complain under my steps. I eat alone, not because I want to, but because no one invites me to join them. Holidays are the cruelest measure of distance, for they remind me of what used to be. For a few years after my wife's death, Mary would still invite me to Thanksgiving or Christmas, but little by little the invitations came less frequently. Excuses multiplied. They were traveling, the grandchildren were busy, Douglas's family had traditions of their own, and when the invitations did arrive, I always felt like a guest rather than kin, seated at the far edge of the table, handed the smaller plate, spoken to as though I were both fragile and irrelevant. Yet I clung to hope with the stubbornness of an old man who cannot admit that the fabric of his life has unraveled. I convinced myself that family ties were too strong to break completely, that no matter how cold my daughter seemed, blood would eventually pull us back together. That hope was why I ironed my shirt and polished my shoes when Mary called and told me she was hosting a family gathering for Thanksgiving this year. Her voice on the phone was oddly formal, almost rehearsed, but I ignored that detail because the mere fact that she was inviting me stirred something inside me that I had not felt in a long while. I pictured myself at a long table, surrounded by voices, not alone. I pictured telling a story from my youth, and my grandchildren listening instead of scrolling through their phones. I let myself believe that this year might be different, that I might once again belong. The days leading up to the gathering carried me like a current. I found myself rehearsing conversations in the mirror, practicing how I might offer a toast without sounding too sentimental. I even went into town to buy a new tie, though I am not sure anyone noticed it but me. On the morning of the event, I stood in front of the wardrobe debating which suit to wear. The darker one made me look thinner, perhaps too much like a mourner, while the lighter one felt hopeful, though outdated. I chose the lighter one because I wanted, perhaps desperately, to appear as though I still belonged to the living, not merely to memory. I arrived at my daughter's house with a bottle of wine I had saved for years, a gift from a colleague at my retirement party. I thought it might symbolize something, a wine that had aged like me, and yet still had flavor worth sharing. As I walked up the driveway, I heard laughter spilling from the house, and I felt a brief thrill of anticipation. Through the window, I could see the table already set, the silver gleaming, the turkey at the center. It looked like the very picture of family unity. For a fleeting moment, I felt certain that I was about to step back into the circle I had been orbiting from the outside for too long. But even as I knocked and waited for the door to open, a shadow passed over me, a warning I tried to ignore. There was hesitation in the footsteps approaching the door, as though whoever was on the other side was not entirely pleased to be greeting me. And when the door did open, Mary's smile was practiced, polite, the kind of smile one gives to an unexpected neighbor rather than to a father. She took the bottle from my hand with a comment about how she was not sure anyone drank wine anymore, then ushered me in quickly, as though I might block the flow of guests. Inside, I saw relatives clustered together in warm conversation, but when they noticed me, the laughter softened into that awkward politeness reserved for someone you do not quite know how to include. I was given a seat near the end of the table, far from the center of attention, and I felt once again the familiar ache of being present but peripheral. Yet even then, I clung to optimism, convincing myself that it was only my imagination, that once the meal began, the warmth would envelop me, that I would raise my glass and be welcomed as the patriarch of this family, not as a tolerated inconvenience. I sat quietly, watching the flicker of candles on polished silver, listening to the rise and fall of voices around me, telling myself that tonight would be the night when distance dissolved, when my daughter remembered not just who I was, but what I had once been to her. The meal had barely begun when I understood that my presence was not a welcome one, but rather a tolerated intrusion, as though the invitation itself had been extended not from genuine desire, but from obligation or, worse, from a calculated need to preserve appearances before the rest of the family and neighbors. The turkey was carved, side dishes passed down the line of hands, glasses filled and refilled, yet all of it seemed to unfold around me rather than with me. The conversations at the table travelled across me like streams that parted around a stone in their path, never touching, never drawing me into their current. I tried to ask my grandson about his college courses, but he gave a curt answer, his eyes sliding back to the glowing screen of his phone, and my granddaughter offered me only a distracted smile before whispering something to her cousin that made them both laugh quietly. I tried not to take offence, telling myself that youth had always been careless, but there was a tone in the laughter, a dismissive sharpness that told me this was more than the ordinary impatience of teenagers with their elders. Mary presided at the head of the table with a kind of managerial efficiency, directing platters here, assigning tasks there, all while making sure her guests were comfortable, her tone warm and gracious to everyone, until her eyes settled on me. With me she was different. Her remarks were pointed, her corrections unnecessary, her smile tight, as though stretched over something hard beneath. At one moment I began to recall a memory of her childhood, a story about the Thanksgiving when she was 7 and had insisted on dressing as a pilgrim, only to spill cranberry sauce all over her white apron. I had barely reached the second sentence before she cut me off sharply, saying there was no need to drag out ancient history, that people wanted to enjoy the meal, not listen to endless stories. A few people chuckled politely, not daring to oppose her, and I felt my voice shrink back into my throat, leaving the story unfinished, as though even my memories had been exiled from the table. It was during the first toast that the true wound was delivered. Mary rose from her chair, glass in hand, thanking everyone for coming, speaking of family unity, of blessings, of how fortunate they all were to be together. Her words flowed with practiced ease, her gaze sweeping across the room, and for a fleeting moment I thought she might turn the spotlight toward me, might acknowledge the years of work and sacrifice that had provided her with the very foundation on which her life now rested. But when her eyes finally reached me, she paused, her smile faltered into something sharper, and she said in a tone that carried clearly to every corner of the room, "And of course, we are grateful that even those who no longer really belong here have still decided to join us tonight." A ripple of unease spread across the table. Forks hesitated mid-air, but no one spoke. Some stared down at their plates, others forced small smiles, and I sat frozen, the words striking with such precision that for a moment I could not breathe. I tried to tell myself I had misheard, that perhaps she had meant something different, but the silence that followed confirmed that everyone had understood exactly what she had said. She lifted her glass as though expecting me to clink mine against it, and in that instant I realized she was daring me, challenging me to either protest and cause a scene or to swallow the humiliation in front of them all. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted my own glass, the wine within trembling like the blood in my veins, and I forced my lips into the semblance of a smile, though every fibre of me burned with shame. We drank, the moment passed outwardly, and the conversations resumed, but for me nothing was the same. I had heard the verdict. In her eyes I did not belong, not to the table, not to the house, not even to the family I had helped create. As the meal continued, the subtler wounds accumulated. When I tried again to enter the conversation, speaking about a news article I had read, Douglas interrupted with a joke about how the elderly should stay away from complicated topics, lest they confuse themselves. Laughter followed, though brittle, and Mary gave him a look that was half amusement, half approval, as though he had done exactly what she wished. At one point, when I asked for more gravy, my granddaughter leaned past me to hand the boat to her cousin, ignoring my request entirely until Mary herself, with an exaggerated sigh, served me as if indulging a troublesome child. Even the smallest gestures became weapons, the rolling of eyes, the condescending tone, the impatient correction of something I had not even said wrong. I realized with growing clarity that the entire performance had been orchestrated not simply to exclude me, but to demonstrate my exclusion, to show others that I was an outsider in my own family. The cruelty of it was not in the words alone, but in the way the others complied through silence. None of them spoke against her. None of them challenged the remark that I did not belong. Instead, they looked away, busied themselves with their plates, allowed the wound to settle into me without interference. It was this complicity that cut deepest, for it told me that my daughter's rejection had already spread like a stain through the fabric of the family, and that my role had already been recast from father and grandfather into something less, tolerated relic to be displayed when useful, dismissed when not. I sat there, chewing food that had turned to ash in my mouth, and thought about all the years I had labored, all the careful savings, all the sacrifices of leisure and comfort, so that Mary could have her education, her wedding, her home. I thought of the nights I had stayed late at the office, the mornings I had risen early, the countless times I had denied myself small pleasures so that she could have hers. And now, in the very house where she sat enthroned at the head of the table, she had declared me unnecessary, a ghost clinging to a family that no longer claimed me. By the time dessert was served, I had stopped tasting anything at all. The laughter that rose from the other end of the table seemed distant, as though muffled by glass, and I found myself staring at my hands resting on the tablecloth, at the veins that stood out beneath the thin skin, at the evidence of age that had become her justification for erasure. When the pie was passed, Mary leaned close enough for only me to hear and whispered, "Don't overeat, Dad. Remember, you're not as strong as you used to be. We wouldn't want another incident." I stared at her, baffled, for there had been no such incident, no collapse, no health scare, nothing to justify the insinuation. It was then that I realized she was not merely excluding me, but constructing a narrative of my decline, a fiction designed to paint me as feeble, incapable, unfit. She was preparing a story to tell others, perhaps to justify decisions already made about my future. In that moment, something hardened within me. I smiled faintly, nodded as though I accepted her concern, and raised my glass one final time. The words had not yet formed, but the intention was there, growing like a storm in my chest. She had told me I did not belong, but before the night was finished, I would make it clear that I was not the one who would be erased. After that first sting, after Mary's declaration that I did not belong, the evening unfolded like a carefully staged play in which every movement was designed to reinforce the verdict she had already delivered. I remained at the table, my glass steady in my hand, my smile frozen into something polite yet hollow, while around me the voices of my family carried on as though nothing had been said, as though my humiliation had been seamlessly absorbed into the fabric of the evening. Yet underneath the outward calm, I began to notice a pattern, a deliberate rhythm of small exclusions, a choreography of dismissals that tightened around me with each passing minute. It was not merely one careless remark, not an accident of words, but a steady campaign to remind me at every turn that I was a guest in a house where once I had believed myself to be the very root of its foundation. The first signs came in the seating itself. I had been placed at the far end of the long, polished table, away from the heart of conversation, near the door to the kitchen where the traffic of dishes and trays passed constantly, as though I were an obstacle to be navigated around rather than a participant to be engaged. When I attempted to draw attention to a story about my own father, a tale of how he had taught me the value of saving pennies until they grew into dollars, my words were drowned out by the sudden announcement of dessert options, Mary raising her voice deliberately to cut across mine. My story withered mid-sentence, left dangling without conclusion, and the table moved forward as though I had not spoken at all. As the meal progressed, Douglas seized the opportunity to reinforce the image of me as a relic whose relevance had expired. He leaned back in his chair, smirking as he recounted to the others how difficult it had been to help me with online banking the previous month, how I had apparently confused the password system and locked myself out. His version was exaggerated, reshaped into a comic anecdote at my expense, and the laughter it drew was tinged with condescension, the kind of laughter one offers not at a joke, but at a figure too weak to defend himself. Mary did not correct him or defend me. Instead, she placed a hand lightly on his arm, her eyes shining with approval, as if she delighted in his performance of my supposed incompetence. Even my grandchildren, once the bright sparks of my life, now joined the chorus of dismissal. When I asked my grandson about his plans for the future, he looked at me with a smirk and said, "Don't worry, Grandpa, I'll make enough money so you don't have to keep counting your pennies anymore." The table erupted in laughter once again, and, though his words were framed as a jest, I could hear in them the echo of conversations that must have been held without me, phrases fed into his ear by his parents, shaping his view of me as miserly, outdated, a man of the past rather than a mentor. For the future. My granddaughter, once the child who begged me to play checkers with her, now rolled her eyes when I asked her about her studies, answering with one-word replies as though speaking to me was a chore. When I corrected her on a simple fact she misstated, she leaned back dramatically and said, "See, I told you he always thinks he knows better than everyone." To which Mary laughed and added, "That's his way, dear, always has been." Each exchange felt like another stone placed on my chest, pressing down heavier, making it harder to breathe freely. I tried to maintain composure, to remind myself that I was their elder, that dignity demanded restraint. But inside, I felt the trembling storm of a man who realizes that the very people he built his life around now dismantle his image piece by piece. I could not understand why they had gathered me here only to strip me of my place. Was this cruelty deliberate? Was it orchestrated to force me into silence, to compel me to retreat of my own accord? The question lingered like a poison on my tongue, and the answer, though not yet spoken, grew clearer with each mocking glance, each careless laugh. The cruelties were not only verbal, but woven into gestures, into omissions so subtle they could have been mistaken for accidents, had they not accumulated with such steady precision. When bread was passed, it stopped short of me until I reached awkwardly across plates. When wine was poured, my glass remained empty until I reminded them. At which point Douglas smirked and said perhaps I had already had enough. When coffee arrived with dessert, mine was lukewarm, left last as though an afterthought. Each small slight was like a needle prick, not fatal in isolation, but together forming a map of disregard across the evening. At one point, I rose from my seat to help clear plates, an instinct ingrained from years of partnership with my wife, when meals were shared responsibilities rather than staged performances. But Mary intercepted me with a sharpness that startled even the others, placing a hand firmly on my arm and saying, "Sit down, Dad. You'll only get in the way. We've got this." Her voice carried that same mixture of command and contempt, as though the act of standing, of trying to contribute, had exposed me as someone incapable, someone who needed to be managed rather than respected. I sat back down slowly, the weight of her hand still burning against my arm, and felt the hollow realization that in her eyes I was no longer the man who had once led this family, but a burden to be managed, a presence to be contained. The final insult came, not from words, but from the way the room itself seemed to tilt against me. As conversation flowed around the table, stories of careers, of vacations, of new purchases and promotions, I found no entry point, no place to insert my voice. Each attempt was deflected, each sentence interrupted, until I sat in silence, staring at the plate before me, the voices blurring into a single drone of exclusion. The candles flickered, the silver gleamed, the food was praised, but for me it was as though I had been sealed inside glass, visible yet untouchable, my existence acknowledged only when convenient to the script they were writing. I sat there and thought of my wife, of how she would have intervened, how she would never have allowed our daughter to speak to me in such a way, how she would have defended me with the quiet ferocity that defined her love. I imagined her voice cutting through the cruelty, reminding them all that without me, none of them would be sitting at that table, that the roof above them had been built on the back of my labor, that the education they flaunted had been paid for with my sacrifices. But she was gone, and her absence was the very vacuum in which this cruelty now thrived, for without her there was no one left to shield me, no one left to insist that I mattered. By the time the plates were cleared and the conversation turned toward plans for the future, I had ceased to expect any recognition at all. I sat in silence, listening as they spoke of vacations, of investments, of renovations to the house, all while pointedly avoiding mention of me or of the home I still lived in. It was then that a whisper of suspicion crept into my mind, faint yet insistent, that this entire evening had been constructed not simply to humiliate, but to prepare the ground for something larger, something darker, that I had yet to fully uncover. It was some time after the plates had been cleared, and the children had drifted away from the table toward the living-room television, that I overheard the words that crystallized everything, words that fell upon me with the sharpness of ice, slicing through any remaining illusions I had clung to throughout the evening. I had risen quietly to stretch my legs, moving toward the hallway under the pretense of checking on the coats I had left by the door, when the muffled cadence of voices reached me from the kitchen. At first I thought little of it, idle conversation between Mary and Douglas as they put away leftovers, but something in the hushed urgency of their tone drew me closer, compelled me to pause by the doorway where the flicker of light underlined the shadows of their movements. I stood there, half in the hall and half in darkness, my breath shallow as though some part of me already knew that I was about to hear what I was never meant to hear. Douglas's voice came first, steady but tinged with impatience, as he said, "We can't keep dragging this out, Mary. The longer he stays in that house, the more complicated everything becomes. You know as well as I do that it's wasted space. We could sell it for a fortune, pay off the rest of the mortgage here, maybe even buy that place by the lake we've been talking about. But none of that can happen as long as he's still clinging on." His words settled into me like stones dropped into water, heavy and final, and though part of me wanted to believe I had misunderstood, the tone carried no ambiguity. Mary answered with a sigh that was both weary and annoyed, as if she had been forced to repeat a conversation too many times. I know, but you can't just rush him. He's stubborn. If we push too hard, he might change the will or give everything to some charity just to spite us. We have to make it seem like his decision, like we're doing what's best for him. Besides, the neighbors would talk if we tried to move him out too soon after Mom. It has to look natural. Her voice trailed into silence, punctuated by the clatter of dishes in the sink. And in that moment, I realized with brutal clarity that this evening was not about family at all, but about maneuvering me into position. Elaborate performance designed to isolate me, to convince me of my own irrelevance, until I surrendered the home that had been the center of my life. I stood there frozen, every muscle taut, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain they would hear it from the other side of the doorway. My mind raced back across the evening, replaying every slight, every dismissal, every whispered aside, now illuminated by this revelation. It was not carelessness or thoughtless cruelty, but strategy. They were building a case against me, not in any court of law, but in the court of family perception, painting me as obsolete, frail, confused, so that when the time came to suggest moving me out of my home, no one would question it. They were rehearsing the narrative they would carry to the rest of the world, that they had done everything out of love, that I had simply grown incapable, that my departure had been inevitable. I thought of my wife in that instant with an intensity so sharp it felt like grief all over again. That house was not just a shelter of walls and windows, but the vessel of our marriage, the cradle of our daughter's childhood, the physical embodiment of every hour I had worked, every sacrifice we had made. To imagine strangers walking through its rooms, tearing out the wallpaper we had chosen together, ripping up the floorboards where Mary had taken her first steps, was unbearable. Yet to Mary, to the daughter for whom I had built it, brick by brick, it was nothing more than equity, a financial asset to be leveraged, a stepping stone toward a life of lakefront luxury. I wanted to storm into the kitchen, to confront them, to unleash the full weight of my fury, but something held me still. Some instinct older than reason. Perhaps it was the knowledge that confrontation would only hand them further ammunition, that they would point to my anger as evidence of instability. Perhaps it was the realization that silence granted me a power they had not accounted for, the power of listening when they believed themselves unwatched. So I stood there, my fists clenched at my sides, my nails biting into my palms, absorbing every word until the conversation shifted to lighter topics, until Douglas joked about the pumpkin pie and Mary laughed with him, their conspiracy folded neatly into domestic banter. When I finally returned to the table, no one looked up. The children were already gone, the remaining guests chatting idly about sports and weather, oblivious to the storm that had just detonated in the shadows of the kitchen. I sat down slowly, carefully, like a man carrying a secret too heavy to let slip, and forced my face into neutrality. Inside, however, something irrevocable had changed. The vague unease of the evening had crystallized into certainty. I was not simply unwanted. I was an obstacle to be removed, a possession to be liquidated, a problem to be solved. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, was planning my erasure. In that moment, the stakes of my life shifted. It was no longer about enduring humiliation in silence or swallowing the bitter pills of neglect. It was about survival, not of my body, though age would eventually claim that, but of my dignity, of the legacy of everything I had built and held sacred. I realized that if I did nothing, if I allowed them to continue weaving their story, I would one day find myself escorted from my own home under the pretense of safety, deposited into some sterile facility where strangers would monitor my meals and measure my pills while the house that had been my anchor was gutted and sold. And worse, it would all be done under the guise of love, wrapped in words like care and responsibility, leaving me stripped not only of my possessions, but of the truth of who I was. That was the moment, the quiet midpoint of the evening, when hope finally dissolved and clarity replaced it. The daughter I had raised, the girl whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose education I had funded, whose wedding I had paid for, had revealed herself not as my ally, but as my executioner, wielding not a knife, but a ledger, calculating the value of my life in square footage and resale price. I sat at that table, smiling faintly at a joke I did not hear, nodding to a remark I did not register, and inside I swore to myself that I would not be erased, that before this night ended I would reclaim the dignity they had tried to strip from me. The rest of the evening unfolded beneath a heavy veil, and though the others may have believed I was merely quiet, drifting in and out of the chatter like an old man lulled by the rhythm of voices, the truth was that my silence had sharpened into watchfulness. Every gesture, every glance, every whispered aside now carried a new weight for me, interpreted through the knowledge I had gained in the hallway. I was no longer guessing at motives. I had overheard the truth. My daughter and her husband were not indifferent or casually unkind, as I had once tried to convince myself. They were deliberate, purposeful, intent on dismantling my presence so completely that when the time came to remove me from my home, no one would raise a voice in protest. And as this understanding settled deeper into me, I began to notice details I had overlooked before, fragments of conversation that might once have seemed harmless, but now revealed themselves as part of a larger, darker design. At one point, my grandson returned to the table, holding a second plate of dessert, and without hesitation placed himself in the chair that had been mine, nudging me further down until I sat nearly at the edge of the tablecloth, half out of the circle. He did not even look at me as he did it, as though it were the most natural rearrangement in the world, as though I had already been demoted to the status of furniture to be shifted as needed. When I cleared my throat softly to reclaim a sliver of space, Mary laughed lightly and said, "Dad, you don't need to sit at the main table if it's too crowded. There's a comfortable armchair in the corner." The words were delivered with the polished tone of concern, the same tone she might use to ask a guest if they preferred tea or coffee, but beneath the veneer was the same verdict as before. You do not belong. Douglas, emboldened by Mary's lead, continued to chip away at me with jokes that presented themselves as harmless, but cut deeply when considered in accumulation. He told the story again of how I had once fallen asleep during a school recital and snored loudly enough to disrupt the performance, though the truth was that I had merely closed my eyes for a moment after a long day at work. He exaggerated the incident until the children laughed so hard they nearly spilled their drinks, painting me as a caricature of the doddering grandfather, unreliable and embarrassing. He followed it up with remarks about the state of my house, describing the wallpaper as outdated, the roof as surely rotting, the plumbing as ancient. "Honestly, Mary," he said with mock seriousness, "the best gift we could give him is to move him somewhere modern, where things actually work. Imagine how relieved he would be not to have to worry about any of that anymore." The table responded with nods and polite laughter, but I caught the gleam in Mary's eyes, the flicker of triumph at the seed being planted in their minds. The cruelty escalated further when the grandchildren joined in. My granddaughter, emboldened by her parents' dismissiveness, leaned toward me with a smirk and asked, "Grandpa, do you even remember my middle name?" The table chuckled in anticipation of my failure, as though the moment had been staged for entertainment. I answered correctly, of course, but she rolled her eyes and said, "He must have just gotten lucky." Then she turned to the others and whispered something I could not catch, sending them into laughter again, leaving me staring at her, wondering when the child who once clutched my hand with trust had become someone who viewed me as a prop in a cruel performance. Even small acts of kindness were turned into weapons. When Douglas refilled my glass of wine, he did it with a flourish, announcing loudly, "Careful now, we don't want Dad overindulging and losing his balance again." There had been no such incident, no stumble, no fall, but his words carried the weight of suggestion, and I saw how quickly suggestion transformed into perception in the eyes of others. A cousin who barely knew me nodded sympathetically, as though agreeing with a fact that had never occurred. I realized then that they were not merely humiliating me in the moment. They were rewriting my identity before the witnesses present, constructing a version of me that was frail, incompetent, a liability. And once that version solidified in the minds of others, it would become impossible to challenge. It was in these moments that my sense of betrayal deepened into something more profound than anger. It became grief. Not grief for myself alone, but grief for the truth that family could turn into adversaries, that love could be eclipsed by greed, that the very people I had trusted most were the ones now dismantling me. I remembered the countless nights of work, the sacrifices, the quiet faith that if I gave enough, if I poured myself into them, the love would return to me in old age. That faith now lay shattered, and in its place grew the bitter knowledge that I was not being cast aside because I had failed them, but because my existence blocked their path to greater comfort. At one point, I excused myself from the table, claiming fatigue, and walked toward the den. As I passed the kitchen again, I heard them continue their conversation, this time more brazen, as though my absence had granted them license to speak freely. "If we can get him to agree by spring," Douglas was saying. "We can have the house on the market by summer. The timing would be perfect. Prices are high right now, and we could finally get ahead. Honestly, I don't even know why he insists on living there alone. It's too much space for one person." Mary replied with a sigh. "He's clinging to memories, that's all. But he can't hold on forever. Once we show him it's for his own good, he'll come around. He has to." I leaned against the wall, my hands trembling, feeling as though I were eavesdropping not on a casual discussion, but on the planning of my own quiet execution. When I returned to the table, the tone had shifted into something almost theatrical, as though the evening had reached its second act. Mary began listing the virtues of various retirement communities, speaking not to me, but to the table at large, as though casually floating ideas for the benefit of everyone, while ensuring that I heard every word. "They have wonderful facilities," she said brightly. "Fitness centers, dining halls, organized activities, even shuttle buses for outings. Some of them are so luxurious you'd think you were on vacation. Honestly, it's not like the old days when retirement homes were sad. Now they're modern, vibrant communities." She paused just long enough for the implication to settle before adding, "It would be so much easier for everyone if Dad didn't have to worry about maintaining that old house anymore." No one contradicted her. No one said that the house was mine, that I had earned the right to live and die within its walls if I chose. Instead, there were nods, murmurs of agreement, even comments about how difficult it must be for me to keep up with repairs. One relative remarked that the stairs must be dangerous, another that the yard was too much work for one man. The chorus of concern grew louder, and though it was cloaked in the language of care, I could hear the calculation beneath it, the alignment of voices in support of a plan already conceived. I sat there, forcing myself to remain still, even as inside me a storm built, the fury of a man realizing he was being erased in real time by the very people who owed him their existence. What struck me most in that moment was the performance of it all, the way they played their roles with such confidence, as though they had rehearsed these lines long before I arrived. Mary as the caring daughter, Douglas as the pragmatic son-in-law, the children as the youthful chorus of inevitability, even the distant relatives lending their voices as a jury that had already reached its verdict. I realized then that the evening had never been about family or gratitude or togetherness. It had been about staging a trial, and I was the defendant, my relevance, my competence, my very belonging put on display and stripped away piece by piece, until the only logical conclusion left was my removal. And yet, even as they tightened the noose of their narrative, I felt something inside me resist. A stubbornness, yes, but also a clarity born from humiliation. They believed they were scripting the story, but they had underestimated the depth of what I carried, the years of memory, the stubborn pride of a man who had built his life from nothing. They saw only age, fragility, inconvenience, but beneath that surface was still the will of the man who had once worked 3 jobs to secure their future, the man who had endured losses greater than this, and survived. And though they had stripped me of the illusion of their love, they had given me something unexpected in return, the clarity of knowing exactly where I stood, and the resolve to answer them, not with pleas, but with action. As the laughter and conversation swelled again around me, I sat in silence, planning. I knew now that there could be no reconciliation, no gentle resolution, no return to what once was. The family I had believed in was gone, and in its place stood opportunists dressed in the costumes of kinship. But I also knew that before this night ended, I would deliver my own verdict, one they had not anticipated, one that would turn their performance against them. They had told me I did not belong. They had staged my erasure, but I would show them that I still had a voice, and that my silence had been the gathering of strength, not the admission of defeat. The tension in the room had shifted imperceptibly, but once I recognized it, I could no longer ignore the change. The air itself had become thicker, charged with the unspoken understanding that something had broken, that we were no longer pretending, not even for the sake of civility. The conversation had lulled for a moment, the table filled with an uneasy quiet as everyone either sipped their drinks or shifted in their chairs, careful not to make eye contact. I could see it in their faces, the shift from performance to expectation. They were waiting for me to react, to either capitulate quietly or speak up in a manner that confirmed my decline. They had thought I would bend, that I would be too weary or too intimidated to challenge them. But in that moment, I understood the full depth of my own strength, the one thing they had miscalculated, the power of refusal, the strength to not be. Silenced when they thought they had already won, I could feel the pulse of their gaze, how each glance seemed to press me further into the chair, as though they were all conspiring to force me out of the narrative they had written. Mary, sitting across from me, wore a mask of polite interest, her eyes flicking to her watch every so often, as though gauging how much longer she would have to indulge me before the inevitable decision was made. Douglas, with his arms crossed in front of him, leaned back with that practiced air of superiority that I had once believed was simply confidence, but now I recognized as contempt. The children were oddly silent, though I could see the flicker of curiosity in their eyes, as if this were some spectacle they were watching unfold. My body felt cold despite the heat of the room, a chill that ran deeper than the temperature. Something old, something buried for years, was awakening within me. I had no idea how long I had been sitting there, lost in my thoughts. But when I finally looked up, the weight of the silence seemed to break like a dam, and I realized they had all been waiting for me to speak. My voice, when it came, was soft at first, a simple clearing of my throat that cut through the quiet like a knife. I had not planned my words, had not rehearsed what I would say, because I realized in that moment that no rehearsed speech would do. There was no neat phrasing, no polished rhetoric that could convey the depth of betrayal I felt. It wasn't about words, it was about action, about reclaiming the space they had so carefully erased. I slowly placed my glass on the table, the wine still swirling in the bottom, a drop clinging stubbornly to the rim, as though it too understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The entire table seemed to hold its breath. "Mary," I said, my voice carrying across the table, firm but not raised. It was the first time in hours that anyone had heard my name spoken without the veneer of false concern or forced politeness. "I've been sitting here, watching and listening. I've been quiet, not because I had no words, but because I was trying to decide what kind of man I wanted to be in this moment." I paused, letting my gaze move from her to Douglas and then to the others, my family, who had grown uncomfortable with the weight of my words. "You've all been so eager to decide for me, to tell me what is best for me, but I think it's time I remind you of something. I'm not just some old man who has no stake in this anymore." Mary opened her mouth to speak, to dismiss me, to interrupt, as she always had, but I held up a hand, silencing her without a word. She froze, her lips still parted, the words she had planned to say hanging in the air. I could see the anger flicker in her eyes, the familiar flash of impatience that had once been reserved for her rebellious teenage years. But now it was something colder, more calculated, as though she were already preparing her counterattack. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. I have spent my life providing for this family, building this home, giving you everything I could possibly give, and this is how you repay me? The words slipped from me without hesitation now, each one a stone hurled into the air. By conspiring to strip me of the one thing I have left, the home that has been the heart of this family since you were a child, by erasing me from the story we once shared, rewriting it to fit your own convenience. My voice grew stronger as I spoke, my eyes never leaving hers, watching the growing discomfort on her face, the uncertainty in her posture, as if she hadn't expected me to fight back in this way. But I wasn't finished. You don't get to decide when I've outlived my usefulness, Mary. You don't get to decide my worth based on some ledger you've made in your head. You don't get to determine my future by presenting your kindness as though it's a gift to be given or withheld. I stood now, the chair scraping harshly against the floor, the room shrinking around me as I moved with purpose, as if every step was reclaiming ground that had been lost. I did not raise my voice, but the power of my presence was undeniable now. This house, this life, this family, it's mine too, and you may think you've already decided my fate, but let me remind you of something you've forgotten. I'm not dead yet. The room was silent, so quiet I could hear the sound of my heart beating in my chest. Mary was still seated, her mouth opening and closing, as if searching for words that would reassert her control. But she was failing to find them. The others, once so eager to play along with her script, now seemed uneasy, caught in the tension I had created. I could see the hesitation in their eyes, the flicker of doubt that told me they had not expected this. They had assumed my meekness would hold, that I would allow them to dictate my fate without resistance, but they had underestimated me, and now the very thing they had sought to suppress was coming to the surface. My voice, my agency, my refusal to be discarded like an unwanted piece of furniture. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to steady the trembling anger that surged through me. But it was no longer the cold, distant anger I had felt earlier. It was something else now, something that had been buried for years, a righteous fury born of years of sacrifice, years of loving and giving with the expectation that it would be returned, only to find it had been used against me. I was not going to let them erase me, not with their polite suggestions, not with their carefully crafted narratives. Not this time. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice now commanding, not pleading. You're going to stop treating me like I'm already gone. You're going to stop pretending that your convenience is more important than the life I've built here. And you're going to start treating me with the respect I deserve, not because I'm old, not because I'm your father, but because I am a person, a man, and I will not be silenced. Mary's face had drained of color, and for the first time that night I saw something in her expression that wasn't anger, but fear, a recognition of the power she had underestimated. The strength she had assumed was gone. She opened her mouth to speak, but this time no words came out. Douglas shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge me. The others too were strangely still, as though the evening had tipped over into something far beyond their control. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle over us, the weight of my words hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I turned to Mary and said simply, I've lived here for more than 30 years. I'm not going anywhere. If you want to sell this house, you'll have to do it without me, because I will fight for this place. And I will fight for my dignity. This is not over. The silence that followed was absolute, and I could see that the family I had once known was now struggling to come to terms with the man I had become in that moment. Not the frail, compliant figure they had hoped for, but someone who would no longer allow himself to be erased. And in that moment, I realized that I had not simply reclaimed my place at the table, I had reclaimed my life, my voice, and my right to stand, to be seen, to be heard. I was still here, and they would have to reckon with that truth. The silence that followed my declaration hung heavily in the room, a tangible thing that pressed down on us all. I stood at the center, the energy of the moment radiating outward, and for the first time that evening, I saw my family not as a collective force, but as individuals who, like me, had their own battles, their own fears, their own desires, that had driven them to this point. For so long, I had believed we were all moving in the same direction, bound together by love and duty. But now I understood that the currents of greed, convenience, and the desire for control had carried them far from me, and I had only just begun to realize how deeply I had been adrift. Mary was the first to break the silence. Her voice, once steady and commanding, now trembled with something I had not expected. Regret. "Dad, I didn't mean for it to be like this," she said quietly, her eyes not meeting mine. She spoke the words like a confession, a reluctant admission that the facade she had carefully constructed was beginning to crack. It's hard, you know? We've got so much on our plates. It seemed like the easiest way to handle everything. Her words were drenched in defensiveness, but beneath them there was something else, a crack in the armor, a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. I could see the weight of her guilt pulling at her, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. I wasn't ready to accept her apologies, not without the acknowledgement that what she had done, what they had all done, was not simply a matter of mistaken kindness or miscommunication. This had been an intentional act, a deliberate rewriting of history, of my place in the family. "You think I don't understand?" I asked, my voice still firm, but the anger had drained from it, replaced by the weary knowledge that the damage was done, that I could no longer afford to pretend. "You think I didn't know what you and Douglas were planning? The house is more than bricks and mortar to me, Mary. You were trying to take that away from me as if it was just another thing to be sold off, another asset to be liquidated. It wasn't about what was best for me, it was about what was easiest for you." Douglas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clasped in front of him, and I saw the briefest flicker of something in his eyes, maybe guilt, maybe frustration, but whatever it was gone too quickly to pin down. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, and he closed it again, as though he suddenly realized he had nothing left to say that would change anything. He could offer no excuse, no justification, not in the face of what had just been laid bare. For a long moment the room was still. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the occasional rustle of someone shifting in their seat. I looked at Mary, saw the way her hands trembled slightly, and for the first time I felt something close to pity. I had always been proud of her, proud of the woman she had become, but now I saw the cracks in her armor too. It wasn't just the house she wanted. It was control. It was the illusion of power, the security that came with deciding someone else's fate. She had made the mistake of thinking that love could be packaged neatly and handed away like a well-wrapped gift, that it could be tied up in a bow and handed off with a smile. But love doesn't work like that. Not really. And not when it's been built on the backs of sacrifices made over a lifetime. "I never wanted to make things hard for you, Dad." she said finally, her voice quieter now, laced with regret. I thought this was the right thing, the thing that would make everything easier for everyone. I didn't think it would be like this, and that's the problem, I said, my voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. You never asked me what I thought, Mary. You never gave me the chance to decide, to be a part of that decision. You made it all for me, without me. And now you want me to accept that you did it out of love. But that's not love, is it? For a long while, no one spoke. The air between us was thick with the weight of unspoken truths, things we all knew but had never dared to confront. The realization that Mary had not simply been acting out of some misplaced sense of practicality, but because she had grown tired of bearing the burden of caring for someone who had once been her hero. The understanding that for her, my age, my frailty, had become an inconvenience, something to be managed, something to be dealt with quietly, like a problem to be solved. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spoke again, my voice softer but no less firm. I'm not going anywhere, Mary. Not now, not ever. If you want to sell this house, if you want to make decisions about my life, you're going to have to do it without me. I've worked too hard for this place, and I won't let anyone take it from me. Not like this, not under these terms. There was a moment of tense silence, and then I turned away from them, from the table where the pieces of our family had once sat, together so many years ago. I stood at the doorway, looking out into the living room, the place where we had gathered so many times, and I felt something stir within me. It wasn't just anger or hurt anymore, but something more powerful, something that had been buried beneath years of unspoken bitterness and fear. It was the quiet strength of a man who had built a life and was not willing to let anyone take that life from him without a fight. Do what you must, I said finally, my voice clear and resolute. But I will not be bullied into submission. Not by you, not by anyone. For a long time, no one moved. Then, slowly, as if the weight of the moment had finally sunk in, I heard the rustling of chairs, the hesitant footsteps of my family rising from their seats. They hadn't expected me to stand my ground, hadn't expected me to fight back with the strength I had left, but I could see it in their eyes now. The shift, the recognition that they had underestimated me. And perhaps, deep down, the understanding that the home they had taken for granted was not so easily theirs to take. As I turned to leave the room, I felt a sense of finality settle over me. The battle for my home, for my dignity, wasn't over, but it had begun. And whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I was still here, and no one was going to erase me. Not now, not ever.